On a sparkling San Francisco gala night, Isabella Reed, a 34-year-old tech CEO, faces a jammed wheelchair and a bold challenge. Fix this, and I'll marry you. Enter Ethan Walker, a 35-year-old humble mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold. What starts as a simple repair ignites hope, sparks courage, and leads to a life-changing journey of love and transformation. Watch the unexpected bond unfold and see how two very different worlds collide. Like, share, and subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. In San Francisco, Isabella Reed had always been known as the woman who could turn ideas into empires. At just 34, she had built her tech company into a billion-dollar enterprise. Her name, appearing on magazine covers, her speeches replayed across networks, her authority unquestioned. Yet the life she once commanded had changed completely after one tragic night. A car accident had left her paralyzed from the waist down. No amount of influence, money, or advanced medicine had restored what she had lost. Her days became filled with treatments and therapies that ended in disappointment, and nights were heavy with silence. She lived in a penthouse with a view of the glittering city, but she no longer saw beauty in it. The skyline was a reminder of the life she had once lived, a life of movement, freedom, and endless ambition. She rolled through her luxury apartment in her wheelchair, her face composed, but her heart hollow. Friends slowly drifted away, unable to handle her. Sharp edges and her hidden despair. Even her board members treated her differently, pretending to be supportive, but quietly, doubting her ability to lead. Her loneliness deepened, though she would never admit it. 2 years after the accident, she agreed to attend a charity gala. Her assistant had insisted it would be good for her, a chance to reconnect with people and remind the world that Isabella Reed was still powerful. Dressed in a tailored black gown, her hair pulled into its usual sleek bun, she forced herself to wear the armor of confidence. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, filled with laughter and conversations about investments and innovation. Isabella wheeled herself across the polished floor, nodding curtly to acquaintances, though her mind was already counting down the minutes until she could leave. But then, in front of a cluster of guests, her wheelchair betrayed her. The motor jammed suddenly, halting in an awkward, noisy jerk. Isabella froze. A hot wave of embarrassment rose in her chest as she felt dozens of eyes flick toward her. Her assistant rushed forward, fumbling uselessly with the controls. The whispers began almost instantly, like tiny needles pricking her skin. Her face remained expressionless, but inside she wanted to disappear, and in that moment, with bitterness sharper than her usual wit, she muttered to the man nearest her, "If someone could actually fix this thing, I'd marry them." The words slipped out like a shield, laced with sarcasm and frustration. A few nearby guests chuckled awkwardly, taking it as one of her cold jokes. But in the corner of the room, someone else heard her. Differently, Ethan Walker had been invited by chance, tagging along with a friend who supplied equipment to the event. At 35, he was a working-class mechanic from Oakland, more comfortable with engines than champagne flutes. Out of place in his second-hand suit, he had lingered quietly at the edges of the room, observing the world of wealth that felt galaxies away from his own. When he saw Isabella struggling, he stepped forward without hesitation. Kneeling beside her wheelchair, Ethan introduced himself with a simple nod. His hands were calloused, his fingernails still stained faintly with grease despite his efforts to scrub them clean. He didn't seem bothered by the crowd or by the sharp stares of men in tuxedos. Pulling a small multi-tool from his pocket, he examined the wiring near the wheel with practiced focus. Isabella watched him, skeptically, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You're not serious," she murmured, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Ethan's expression remained calm, steady. "Machines break," he said softly, "but they can always be fixed." The guests around them whispered louder, amused at the sight of a mechanic crouching on the ballroom floor in front of San Francisco's most famous CEO. But Ethan ignored them. His hands moved with precision, his brow furrowed in concentration as he adjusted the faulty connections and tightened loose parts. Sparks of laughter fluttered around the room at the sight of grease-stained hands against a diamond-studded gown. Yet Isabella, despite herself, felt an unexpected sense of curiosity. This man didn't look at her with pity or awkwardness. He looked at her wheelchair like it was simply another challenge to solve. Minutes later, the chair hummed back to life, rolling forward smoothly as though it had never failed. A hush fell over the group of onlookers before they quickly turned their attention elsewhere. The moment, forgotten by all but two. Isabella stared at the machine, then at Ethan, her mask of control flickering just slightly. "Well," she said, her voice caught between dry humor and reluctant admiration. "Maybe I should keep my jokes in check." Ethan rose to his feet, brushing his hands against his suit. He offered a faint smile. "Or maybe some promises are meant to be real." For the first time in years, Isabella didn't have a quick retort. She simply stared at him, half amused, half shocked, uncertain why a stranger's words could unsettle her so deeply. As he stepped back into the crowd, blending into the sea of strangers in tuxedos and gowns, she realized she wanted to know more about him. She didn't admit it, not to her assistant, not even to herself, but something had shifted. In the middle of a glittering ballroom, surrounded by shallow conversations and artificial smiles, mechanic with rough hands had managed to reach the one part of her she thought was unreachable. That night, as her driver guided her home, Isabella replayed the moment again and again. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence, a random act of luck. But the memory of his calm voice lingered. Machines can always be fixed. She wondered just for a moment if he had meant more than her chair. Days later, Isabella sat in her office reviewing quarterly reports on her tablet. Her assistant entered quietly, placing a slip of paper on her desk. "The mechanic from the gala," she said softly. "He asked me to give you his number in case the chair malfunctions again." Isabella stared at the digits, hesitating. Normally, she would have dismissed it as irrelevant. She had access to the best technicians money could buy. Yet something about that man's steady confidence lingered in her memory. Almost without realizing it, she saved the number into her phone. That evening, as the city glowed beneath her penthouse windows, Isabella's thumb hovered over his contact. It was absurd, she told herself. What could she possibly have in common with a man who fixed cars in Oakland? But curiosity won. She dialed. When Ethan's calm voice answered, she almost hung up. Instead, she cleared her throat and said the chair seemed fine, but she wanted to ensure it wouldn't break again. Ethan's reply was simple. "I'll come by, just to make sure." There was no hesitation, no awe at who she was, only sincerity. When Ethan arrived the next morning, toolbox in hand, he looked entirely out of place in her marble-floored penthouse. His suit from the gala had been replaced by a simple flannel shirt and work boots. Isabella observed him quietly as he bent to inspect the chair. "Still rolling fine," he said, smiling as if they shared a private joke. For the first time in years, Isabella found herself laughing softly. He wasn't intimidated by her wealth or her world. He was simply himself. That disarmed her more than she cared to admit. In the days that followed, Isabella found reasons to call him again. A faint squeak in the wheels, a slight shift in the seat, even when she suspected nothing was wrong at all. Ethan always came. Sometimes he brought sandwiches from a small deli he loved, insisting she try something other than catered meals. Sometimes he stayed longer than necessary, telling her about his small workshop and how he dreamed of opening a community garage where kids could learn mechanics instead of falling into trouble. Isabella listened, fascinated by his unpolished honesty. One evening, as Ethan adjusted the brakes on her chair, he shared something he hadn't told anyone at the gala. His younger sister had once been in a wheelchair after a childhood accident. He spoke of the helplessness he felt, of long nights fixing and refixing the chair to make it easier for her to move around. His sister eventually recovered, but the memory stayed with him. Isabella noticed how his voice softened when he spoke about family, how his eyes carried both pain and resilience. She realized his care for her chair wasn't just mechanical, it was deeply personal. What startled Isabella most was how normal he made her feel. He didn't treat her like a fragile figure, nor did he walk on eggshells the way her colleagues and so-called friends did. If she snapped, he teased her gently. If she grew quiet, he filled the silence with stories of engine failures and neighborhood kids who wandered into his garage. There was no pity, only presence. Slowly, almost against her will, Isabella began looking forward to his visits. She caught herself smiling at her phone, waiting for his texts that were always short but thoughtful. One night, when the city lights flickered against her window, Ethan cooked dinner in her kitchen. Nothing extravagant, just pasta with garlic bread, the kind of meal she hadn't tasted in years. She teased him about the mess he made, but she ate every bite, savoring the unfamiliar simplicity. Later, when she frowned at her therapy schedule, Ethan nudged her chair closer to the treadmill. "Machines can be fixed," he reminded her, tightening the brakes firmly. "But so can people if they don't give up." For a long moment she couldn't speak. His words touched something inside her that had been buried. Isabella began to notice subtle changes in herself. She laughed more easily, even at silly jokes. She agreed to resume therapy sessions she had long abandoned. She allowed herself to imagine mornings without dread. The isolation that once felt suffocating now seemed thinner, as though his presence had cracked a window open in her world. He didn't fix her loneliness with grand gestures. Instead, he repaired it piece by piece, the way he repaired machines, patiently, persistently, with quiet determination. And somewhere between shared meals and conversations on her balcony, she realized she was beginning to feel hope again. For Ethan, too, something was shifting. At first, he saw Isabella as another client, someone who needed his skills. But the more time he spent with her, the more he saw the woman behind the reputation, the Isabella who carried grief in silence, who still had fire in her spirit even when her body betrayed her. He admired her sharp wit, her courage, and the way she listened to his dreams as though they mattered. Her eyes, he was not just a mechanic from Oakland, he was someone who made a difference, and that recognition stirred emotions he hadn't expected. One evening, after a long day, Isabella found herself staring at Ethan as he leaned over the chair, tightening bolts. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands steady. She realized she wasn't just watching a mechanic, she was watching someone who had quietly become essential to her life. She tried to push the thought away, afraid of what it meant, afraid of what people would say if they saw her, the billionaire CEO, growing close to a man who fixed engines. But the truth was undeniable. For the first time in years, someone wasn't just repairing her chair, he was repairing her hope. And hope, Isabella discovered, was the most dangerous and beautiful thing she had allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Months slipped by, and with them, Isabella's life slowly transformed. The once pristine calendar on her desk, filled only with board meetings and investor calls, now carried new appointments, daily rehab sessions. At first, the process was torture. Her muscles ached, her arms shook, and sweat poured down her temples. There were days she cursed the therapists, cursed herself, even cursed Ethan for convincing her to try again. But no matter how angry or broken she felt, he was always there. He clapped for her victories, no matter how small, and steadied her when she threatened to collapse. Every step of therapy became a battle, and every battle became a story of resilience. Ethan never sugarcoated the pain. He told her it would hurt, told her there would be nights when she would want to give up, yet he also promised her it would be worth it. Isabella, who had lived years hiding behind sarcasm and wit, found herself clinging to his words as though they were lifelines. The fire in his eyes made her believe she wasn't just trying to stand again. She was reclaiming the pieces of herself she thought were gone forever. Some nights, after exhausting sessions, Isabella would return to her penthouse and collapse into her chair, too drained to move. Ethan would follow her, carrying bags of groceries or simple takeout. He would cook while she rested, filling the quiet apartment with the aroma of garlic and herbs. She would watch him from across the kitchen island, fascinated by how naturally he fit into her world, as though he had always belonged there, somewhere between shared meals and laughter. She realized her home no longer felt like a lonely palace, it felt alive. The turning point came on a sunny morning, when Isabella arrived at the clinic already tense. That day, her therapist had planned for her to attempt the parallel bars, a step she had been dreading for weeks. Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion in his eyes. She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't ready, but the way he looked at her like he saw strength she didn't know she had, gave her courage to try. With trembling fingers, Isabella gripped the cold steel of the bars. Her arms shook as she pulled herself upward, her legs stiff and uncooperative. The room seemed to fade around her, every sound drowned out by the pounding of her heartbeat. For a terrifying moment, she thought she would fall. But Ethan's voice broke through the panic, calm and unwavering. "One breath at a time. You don't need to run, you just need to stand." And somehow, with sweat dripping down her forehead and tears stinging her eyes, she rose to her feet. The first step came slowly, almost painfully. Her knees wobbled, her balance faltered, but her body obeyed her will. The clinic erupted in cheers, nurses clapping, therapists crying. Yet Isabella saw none of it, her gaze locked on Ethan, who stood just a few feet away, pride radiating from him like sunlight. His smile was wide, his eyes wet with emotion. In that instant, Isabella felt a rush of triumph, not just for walking, but for proving that her story wasn't over. For the first time in years, she believed she could rewrite it. Later that evening, back at her penthouse, Isabella leaned on her new cane as she entered the living room. Her body was sore, her muscles burned, but her spirit was soaring. Ethan sat on the couch, waiting, his hands folded nervously in his lap. She stood before him, taking a shaky step closer, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Do you remember what I said the night we met?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Ethan blinked, confused for a moment, then chuckled. "About marrying the guy who fixed your chair?" he replied, half joking. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "Yes, that." Silence filled the space between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Isabella reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "You didn't just fix the chair, Ethan, you fixed me." The words left her lips like a confession, raw and real. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. For weeks, he had pushed aside the growing feelings in his chest, reminding himself of the gulf between their worlds. Yet now, looking into her eyes, he saw only truth. She didn't care about the gap, she cared about him. In that quiet moment, time seemed to stand still. The city lights twinkled beyond the glass walls, but all that mattered was the connection between them. Ethan lifted her hand gently, pressing it against his chest, where his heart pounded wildly. "You fixed me too," he whispered. Isabella felt her throat tighten, her emotions threatening to spill over. For years, she had hidden her loneliness beneath layers of sarcasm and wealth. Now, standing here on her own unsteady legs, she realized she had found something money could never buy: love, hope, and belonging. From that night forward, their relationship grew stronger, rooted not in grand gestures, but in small, unshakable moments. Ethan was there for every stumble, every triumph, every tear. Isabella, once defined by her wheelchair and her empire, began to redefine herself through laughter, through effort, through love. And Ethan, the mechanic who once fixed engines in a small Oakland garage, found himself building something far greater, a future with the woman who had once joked about marrying the man who could fix her chair. Neither of them laughed at the joke anymore. For them, it had become a promise.